This is our first lecture for childhood and adolescence. So I like to start by talking about sort of the history of the field of developmental psychology and just some of the basic terms and concepts you're going to need throughout the class that we're going to be coming back to over and over again. So let's start with the history. So the early origins of how people viewed children in the ancient times and Middle Ages, children were viewed as innately evil and they were punished very harshly. They were treated as property of the adults and even as servants or slaves. They were nurtured until about the age of 7, and that was what they called the age of reason. And when children reached that age, they were expected to join adults. They did adult activities, work, ate adult food. They were essentially just treated as tiny adults. And if you look at the artwork from this period, you can see that that's how they're depicted too. All their proportions are the same as adults. Their clothing was the same. They were really just viewed as essentially incomplete adults and nothing that was different or special. Then in the 1700s, we see John Locke, that's this first guy here. He's a famous philosopher. He was essentially the first behaviorist. He believed in what was called tabula rasa, that children are born as blank slates. So essentially, children come into the world without anything. They're just empty vessels waiting to be filled, or a blank piece of paper waiting to be written on. He emphasized obedience in children. He told people to punish children with shame and guilt and reward them with flattery and praise. He believed that everything is learned through the environment and through experience. So children are born knowing nothing, having nothing. They learn everything through their environment. The second picture here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was sort of the opposite of John Locke. He believed that children are born good and with everything they need to survive and develop. He thought that adults should just stay out of their way. And children learn on their own by being in nature and following their inclinations. So he thought if you just stepped back and let children do what they do, they'll learn everything they need to know. So these two are really polar opposites. Then we get into the 1800s. Everyone should recognize this guy here. That's Darwin. So Charles Darwin created the scientific study of children. He was interested in the difference between humans and animals. He wanted to know when do skills emerge, how does development occur, and what behaviors are innate and which are learned. So he created what was called a baby biography. He observed his own child and wrote down everything he observed, and that created this diary of how a child develops. He concluded from his research that Locke was wrong, that children aren't born as blank slates. He agreed more with Rousseau, that children are born with what they need in order to grow and develop. The next guy here is G. Stanley Hall. You probably haven't heard of him before. The reason he's important in this field is that he made child study an academic discipline. He was the one who made it so you could go to a university and actually study child development. So he made it something that you could study like through the years of questionnaires or surveys. He made it a scientific discipline and an academic discipline. So child development is divided into a few movements. The first is the child study movement. If you remember, I said that the goals of developmental psychology are to describe, explain, and optimize. So this would be the describe stage. They cared about observation and description. So they used naturalistic observation and description to create logs of what it was like for infants and children to develop. The next movement was the child development movement. Now we saw an increase of funding for studies, and they started to do normative and psychometric studies. So they were really starting to see what was normal child development. They were starting to create charts. They created catalogs of norms and standards that you should see in child development. During this movement, we see the emergence of behaviorism, which is more of what Locke talked about, which was how children learn through the environment, through punishments and rewards. We'll talk more about behaviorism later. We also saw a huge cognitive push in schools. Sputnik launched in the 1950s, and this led to a push in cognitive development that is still around today, where schools were really emphasized to drive the learning and cognitive development of their children. This is also where we saw the beginnings of the Head Start program, which was a preschool program. The movement we are currently in is developmental psychology. So what makes this one different than the previous movements is that this one, now we use the scientific method. So we use research that is aligned with theory, and it's more about explaining rather than describing. It also takes into account the emotional needs of children, not just the cognitive needs. So we got to see the research into emotional development begin in around the 1960s. It's not just about their cognitive needs. And we also started to look into brain development. So research on brain development was interested in adult development rather than children, and this is most likely due to the baby boomers. But the technology that arose to help study the brain started to get applied to the development of children too. So neuroscience and all the scans that we can use to see inside the brain. We were able to study brain development in a whole new way. We also saw in this era the longitudinal study of attachment started in the 1970s, and it's still going. They're still following the same infants they started studying in the 70s. Research also started to look more at SES, gender, school readiness, genetic factors, and more emotional and social competence. So they're really moving beyond the realm of behaviorism now, and we're looking at a lot of different factors. So now I'm going to take you through some of the terminology of development, just some of the terms you'll need to know. So the basic terms. Infant. The word infant comes from Latin, which means not speaking. And this is the period of life before the development of complex speech. So 1 or 2 word sentences don't count. That's not complex speech. So we usually consider infant to be the first 2 years. Next is a child. A person in the period of development between infancy and puberty. That's what we call a child. So between 2 years old to puberty, which is about 12. And we divide this into early childhood, which is about the ages of 2 to 5, and middle childhood, which is 6 to 12-ish. In this course, I consider toddlers as a separate stage between infancy and early childhood, because I believe it's different enough from both to be considered its own stage. But most textbooks will group toddlers either in with infants or early childhood. The next term is adolescent. This is a person who is in the stage after puberty, but not yet an adult. Full adulthood is not reached at 18. The brain doesn't stop developing until about 25. So an adolescent is someone between about the ages of 13 to 25. Our next term is growth. This is by the process by which an organism increases in size, weight, strength, etc. as they develop. It's just how things increase in quantity. Growth. So children get taller, they get heavier, they get stronger. That's growth. That is not the same as development. Growth and development are not the same terms. Development is the process by which organisms gain new features and traits, grow and become more complex and specialized. So growth is a part of development, but it's not all of it. So development is more about getting more complicated. It's the orderly appearance over time of physical structures, psychological traits, behaviors, and ways of adapting to the demands of life. It's so much more inclusive than just growth. So the terms growth and development do not mean the same thing. Again, growth tends to refer to quantitative changes, getting taller, stronger, etc., while development refers to the qualitative changes, like the way a teenager thinks in a fundamentally different way than a child. Next terms I want you to know the difference of is normal versus average. When you're talking about child development, you hear a lot of averages, but I want to make sure that you understand the difference between these terms. So this is what's called a normal curve. If you plot just about anything, it falls into this curve. It's a theoretical model that indicates how likely something is to happen. The higher the curve at that point, the more likely it will happen. So points in the middle here have an extremely high likelihood, and the points at the ends have a low likelihood. So these would be very high numbers or very low numbers. So if you're going to be measuring a child's height, really tall children would be over here, really short children would be over here, and this would be the average height. Okay. So this line here represents the average, okay? And this range here represents normal. Okay. So average is the line in the middle. It is the literal middle of the normal curve. This just means that most instances fall in the middle. The closer we are to average, the more likely it will happen. Normal is the range between these two lines. Okay, the more extremes are just less likely. So being over here is less likely, but it's still normal. Being down here is less likely, but it's still normal. For example, babies start walking at about age 1. That's average. That's the line in the middle. But a baby who starts walking at 7 months, that's early. That'd be over here, but it's still normal. What about 15 months? That's older than average. It'd be over here. That's late, but it's still normal. You'll be surprised how wide the range of normal is in most areas of child development. So don't confuse average with normal. Okay, some terms about development. Qualitative means changes in type or kinds. For example, a baby starts to walk. That is fundamentally different than crawling. Quantitative changes are changes in amount. So children get taller, heavier, faster, etc. Okay, so quantitative are things you can count and measure. Qualitative are changes in types or kinds. Leaps and plateaus. Despite popular perception, development does not happen in a line like this. If you were measuring a child's weight or height, it doesn't happen in a smooth line like this. Sometimes development jumps forward, seeming to occur overnight. Other times, development hits a plateau, going an extended period of time with seemingly no progress. So development looks more like this, rather than a smooth line. For example, in language development, a toddler may gain 20 new words in the period of a week. So you would see a jump like this. Then they may go a few weeks with no new words. After that, they might have another vocabulary explosion and jump up again. Researchers have also found that physical growth in infants happens like this. They'll go a few days without gaining weight, then gain a bunch of weight in one day, and then stop again. So keep in mind that development is not a steady process. And also, even though we may not see anything happening, development is still happening behind the scenes. Sometimes the brain has to develop before new things are possible. Okay, domains of development. These are the domains we'll be covering. First is physical. These are the motor skills, the capacity for movement, particularly in the nervous system, so bones and muscles and hormonal changes. For example, puberty, that's all part of the physical domain of development. The two big ones are gross motor skills. These are big movements using big muscles like running and jumping. And then there's fine motor skills, which are small muscle skills, writing, drawing, playing an instrument, etc. We will be talking about both of these. The next domain is cognitive. This is changes in mental abilities, such as the processing of information through perception, learning, memory, language, moral reasoning, problem solving, decision making. It's things that are happening in the brain. We'll cover this a lot. Emotional development is changes in how an individual experiences different feelings and how those feelings are expressed, interpreted, and dealt with. And the last is social development. This is the changes in relationships with other people, skills interacting with others, the ability to form and maintain relationships, etc. Okay. In this class, social and emotional development will be grouped together. And we will continue this in the next video.